Hello, my name's Samuel Boswell. I'm a business developer at OneClick LCA, and today I'm going to be running through the Carbon Designer 3D tool. So let me just share my screen. Okay, so you can see we're currently on the project homepage of a project that I've named Carbon Designer 3D Demo. We've got the general information here, and then below that, I've got two calculation tools, the BREEAM UK and the RICS Whole Life Carbon Assessment. And to access the Carbon Designer 3D tool, you will have already had to have created a design. You don't necessarily have to have filled in that design. And in fact, using Carbon Designer 3D right from the outset to give you those baselines is one of the things that it's very useful for. So to access it, I click on the button at the top here, and it will ask me which calculation tool I want to use. It doesn't make a huge amount of difference which one you go for. So I'll choose the BREEAM UK. And the first thing and then it then lands us on the Carbon Designer 3D process. So the first thing is it's asking us whether we want to work on a design that we've done before or whether we want to create a new one. So in this case, I'll create a new design. And then it will ask what name we should give it. So I'll call this one Carbon Designer 3D Demo. We then choose a reference building. So of course, if the reference building is in the UK, we choose that one. We specify what the floor area of the building is. Then we click next. We can choose the building type at this point. And so we choose the one that's as close as possible to what we think our design will be. I'll then click next again. And now we can define the scope. So what parts of the building do we and do we not want to include in the analysis? And so there's a number of different scenarios in which you can use Carbon Designer 3D or ways in which it can be very useful for your process. And the first one, of course, is just doing a full building LCA on our hypothetical building. And so you can do this from the outset to create baselines to examine what potential impacts there would be from different frame types, from different material choices, different number of stories, things like that. But it can also be used in terms of a retrofit project in which you can make a comparison between what the impacts of building a complete new build would be, as opposed to what the impacts of a retrofit decision would be. And so if you were to be doing it that way, what you can always do is create an entirely new build and then duplicate this design and just simply remove all the things that you're keeping. So foundations, maybe ground floor slab, structure, and potentially even the enclosure. So you'll only actually be working on the finishes and services. Another scenario in which it can be very useful in terms of defining the scope, so which things you choose Carbon Designer 3D to include, is if you have a Revit model, for example, and there might be information on the services that you don't necessarily have. The earlier stages, this might be information that you don't have. And so what you can do is you can import all the information that you do have in your Revit model or whatever other integration you might be working with. And you can then use Carbon Designer 3D to fill in the gaps. So you can then just merge the data from your Revit model and Carbon Designer 3D, and it will then give you a more complete estimation on what the building's impacts will be. So we also can choose how many floors above ground level there are, any heated flooring from these two. We have a choice between different frame types here. So there's a couple of different concrete, there's a steel frame, and there's a couple of timber frames as well. The piling length is actually for visual purposes for the 3D model that you'll see shortly. But then below that, if there's any special types of foundations, you can also include them too. And so with all of that now in check, I'll click next. And it then lands us on this page here. So we can really start to see what's actually going on with the Carbon Designer 3D. So it's creating what we call a shoebox design. So very basic, very simple. But the reason that this is relevant at the very beginning stages is because it doesn't matter too much the form of the building. What we're really trying to hone in on is what the impacts of different building material choices have. And so therefore we're going to switch between different material buildups for each of the building elements and see what impacts they have in order to then navigate to a optimum solution for decarbonizing the building. We can adjust all of these dimensions. So if you do have a quite a basic massing model. You can technically use this before you've ever even drawn anything as well, but we can tweak it so we bring it as close as possible to what we think our design will be. So I can change building heights and so on. And if I then click calculate areas, it then gives us a little bit more scope to adjust the dimensions of the rest of the elements of the building. So we can change the total length of columns, beams. We've got the amount of area the windows cover on the facade, and also how much area the services would be covering within the building. So once you're happy with all the dimensions that you've set there, you can click next. We have a number of different templates, or sorry, you can create templates that will allow you to get off to a kind of a good start on certain maybe design aspects that you tend to expect your designs would use in from the outset. So you can use templates in that sense. But for now, I'll just stick with that and I'll click submit. And what that's then going to do is take all the information that we've just input and it will create a hypothetical building, and it's going to be applying material build-ups to all the different elements of the building. And so these have been defined based off of the reference building. So we chose UK, also the building type and the frame and so on. And so then it applies what it thinks is a reasonable assumption for the various different details within the building. Okay, so we've now landed on the results page. You can see I've got my design here again. It's approximately 559 kilograms of embodied carbon per meter squared. And if I scroll a little bit further below, we can click activate carbon viewport or carbon view, and it will show us a nice visualization of where the main hotspots are coming from. On the left-hand side, you can see we've got a graph showing us the total tons of embodied carbon per building element. And so, for example, floor finishes are quite high, floor slabs are high as well. But we can also show the data by material, by classification, and also by total. So currently we only have one design included in our project here, but we can actually have up to 4 to compare. So either I choose a design that I've done before, and it will give us a drop-down menu from that. We can either create a new one, like I just have, or I can just simply copy this design here. So if I call this one Carbon Designer Demo 2, and click copy, we'll then have 2 identical designs right next door to each other. And so when I come back to the by building element, you can see that the graph has now become stacked. And so any changes that we'll make, we'll be able to see instantaneous results and be able to compare what sort of impact that's had. And so I think floor slabs is something I'm going to choose to adjust to start with. And if I scroll down further, we can start seeing what's actually going on with our building and what's been applied. So I'll make sure that I come to my second design, which is here, to make the adjustments. And it was the floor slabs that I wanted to change. So if I come to that, either I can search through all elements. I can also see the design information. So this is information that we put in at the start. But I can also then come to the structure where I know that floor slabs is under. So if I click here, we can then see the construction that has been applied. So for those of you who haven't seen the one-click software before, there's 2 types of data that you can really put into a project. And so either individual materials, so say just a brick, but you can also input information, material data points that are called constructions. And constructions are simply made up of multiple materials. And so in fact, we can see what that looks like by clicking on these 3 dots here. I can click edit, and you can see I can actually adjust each of the individual materials within this material data point here. So I can choose from different insulations, different concretes, and so on. I can adjust thicknesses. So there's a lot of flexibility for tweaking each of the material data points to what as close as possible to what you think the design may be. For now, I'll just leave that. But more importantly, if I click on edit floor slabs and then show unused resources, we can see we've got a number of different floor slab designs that I can choose from. So we've got wooden joist here. There's material concrete composite. There's a glue lamp timber floor slab there. And if I scroll a bit further below, you then have add new resource where there's even more. And so if you do create private constructions within the main software, which is something that you can do, these will also come up here. So you can use your own specific types of details within Carbon Designer 3D. For now, I'll just stick with these 2. These default ones here. And maybe, for example, we don't need 100% of the floors to be hollow core concrete slabs, maybe just the lower floors. So what I'm going to do here is just add 80% of the floors can be wooden joist, and then only 20% need to be the hollow core concrete slabs. So once I make that change, I'll let it load. I'll then tweak this one. And once that's finished loading, when I come back up to the top here, you can see what kind of change that has made. And we've actually managed to reduce the total impact of the project by about 6%. So obviously that design decision there was a good one. And yeah, this is really how you use Carbon Designer 3D. So you get that instantaneous feedback. And one of the most relevant aspects of doing an LCA at this stage of any building project is that the decarbonisation potential of a project halves at each stage, because as the design develops, certain things become more set in stone. It becomes more difficult to make these sorts of changes. But if you're able to see what the impacts will be, right from the outset, or even get a close estimation to what that might be, you're therefore able to address those things, and that's why you then have the widest scope to reduce the impacts that will potentially occur. So this is where the real strength of doing life cycle assessments right from the outset and using Carbon Designer 3D comes from. So say if I'm happy with all of this stuff, I can then scroll down and save this design to project. And when I do that, I can either create a new design or I can update my existing, and so for example, if you were importing into a project that you've imported from Revit, this is where you could either merge the data, but in this case, I'm going to overwrite the existing data and click save. And that will then bring all of this information from Carbon Designer 3D back to the main software, where you can then work on it as if it's an ordinary project. And so I'll just let that load, and I'll then show you what the data that's gone into the main software looks like. Okay. Super. So some data hasn't been imported, but that's fine. It would be things like construction site operations, energy consumption, calculation period. These aren't as kind of laborious as inputting information about the building materials. But if I click here, we can then actually see what sort of data has been imported. Okay, so we're currently on the building materials tab. If I scroll down, you can see each of the sections, so foundations and substructures, vertical structures, have all got information now input for it. And you can see they've got this icon here, this plus symbol. And if I click on that, well, actually, that's not the best example, but maybe in situ concrete columns, you can see they're made up of multiple materials, and the quantities reflect the dimensions of the entirety of that construction. So this is really how Carbon Designer 3D works, is it's applying constructions to all of the different building elements, and then you can just simply import that back to the main software. So that's it. And I hope that was useful and you found that informative. And if you would like to find out any more, please feel free to get in touch.